so much, everybody, for coming today. My name is Katie Sigmund, and I'm the Natural Resources Manager for the Wild Rivers Conservancy of the St. Croix and Namakagon. I'm just going to give a little intro about the Conservancy and who we are. So we're the official nonprofit partner of the St. Croix National Scenic Riverway, which is a unit of the National Park Service. I always love getting reactions from people that did not know that the St. Croix is a national park. So it's a national treasure right outside of actually this library window, which is awesome. A little bit about the watershed. I did bring a map here. As you can see, it's roughly the size of the state of New Jersey, 7,800 square miles. And so it includes both the Namakagon and St. Croix River. It is one of the first originally 8 designated wild and scenic rivers in the country. So it's very special. And our mission is to inspire stewardship to forever protect the rare ecological integrity of the St. Croix and Namakagon River. And so with that, I'm going to introduce Craig, and he'll take it from here.
Thank you, Katie. All right, I gotta hold it up a little bit. I wrote my stuff down. So, all right, I'm Craig Hamer. I'm a board member with Wild Rivers Conservancy. And I'm really proud of the work that we do to support the National Park and the National Scenic Riverway of the St. Croix and Namakagon Rivers. Our mission is a thriving watershed, forever accessible, scenic, and wild. And I think it's very simple, but it says a lot. I'm the chair of one of the committees for Wild Rivers, and it's the Land and Water Committee. And what we do on that committee is we look at issues that would threaten the river or ways that we can help to preserve or make better the river. And we do that by digging in on details, coming up with strategies that are implementable and align with the vision of what Wild Rivers is. So the proposed Talon mine is exactly the type of developing threat to the waterway that I think we need to look at. So this listening session that we have here today is a cooperative effort between Wild Rivers Conservancy, which you've just heard a couple of minutes of discussion, and Water Legacy. And so it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Paula McAdoo, and my goal is to make her blush. So Paula is the Advocacy Director and Legal Counsel for Water Legacy. Paula has an impressive resume spanning some 43 years of legal and civilian advocacy. Early in her career, Paula was litigator for the Dalkin Shield defective product cases. She served as Minnesota's Special Assistant Attorney General, and she was a member of the St. Paul City Council. Her legal environmental advocacy work has been included in the book, Turn Here Sweet Corn. And Paula is the author of multiple published professional articles and has also received numerous awards for her work. So, rounding that up, starting in 2009, Paula has served as Water Legacy's Advocacy Director, Legal Counsel, and primary staff for policy, strategy, fundraising, and media relations. Paula does it all. So, thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Craig, and I'm very grateful for the partnership today with the Conservancy. I think it's really important that I say right up front that if I say anything controversial, it's only about Water Legacy. Don't blame them. But the partnership is really important because we face a very serious threat to the Mississippi River watershed and to the St. Croix River watershed. So let me tell you a little bit. First of all, I want to say that Sophia Patain is not here, probably because she got COVID. She was at the expo all weekend and just lots and lots of people, and she talked to them all closely. And I have moved away from being the central person doing media because now I have an incredible partner in Sophia, and I hope she actually has something else that's not COVID and that she's well very quickly. But if you haven't signed up, there's a sign-up sheet for the Conservancy newsletter, and also for if you want to be on a list to get more information as we learn more about the Talon mine. We'll be photocopying and share them. So you sign one, I'll put we'll share copies. You don't have to sign both. And there's cookies and bubble water in the bag, cookies if you're sort of feeling indulgent, and bubble water if you want to feel virtuous. And I'm going to say that there is going to be a special time of questioning at the end, but if you feel that it's important that you ask a question in the middle, go ahead, raise your hand. I will repeat it, not because I'm trying to make it look silly, but just so that it can be heard on the video presentation. Now, here's Water Legacy's story. Water Legacy was started in 2009 by people who live in northern Minnesota. And it was at that time that there was a sense that the community was coming together to protect the boundary waters from copper nickel mining threat. But there really wasn't anyone who was stepping up to protect the Lake Superior watershed, which is the place where the polymet mine was being proposed, actually the first sulfide mine being proposed in Minnesota. And so our board members are people who were just activist regular citizens in northern Minnesota, some of whom had very close relationships with the tribal people up there. And they said, we need to oppose sulfide mining, not only in the Boundary Waters watershed, but in any watershed in Minnesota that's water rich, because it's damn dangerous. And initially, I was very naive. I thought we'd get some experts, we'd get some facts together, we'd show the agencies that this was really a bad idea, and the thing would go away. Well, it's 14 years later, and what we've learned is that there's something wrong with our system. And so far we have been, unlike the line 3 is the normal case, where the government just holds hands with the industry and they push it through. But in the polymet case, in my opinion, partially because the agency so far overreached, we were able actually to halt and reverse the permits while the whole legal issue was going on. So polymet, though we haven't killed it dead, hasn't destroyed anything yet. They haven't dug their holes, they haven't blasted their rock, they haven't spilled their pollution into the water. But in the process of working on what was initially primarily a mining-oriented situation, we learned also that Minnesota hasn't been regulating its taconite mines. Minnesota's been rolling back our water quality standards, sometimes not updating permits for decades. So Water Legacy moved from being just, we're going to make sure polymet doesn't open the door for all the other mines, to looking more broadly at how do we make sure that our water quality standards are strong and our community activism is strong, and that there's a legal way to defend all this. So that's, in order to do that, we do a lot of science, we work with a lot of experts. Our board president is former manager of the EPA's regional wetlands office, and so she really understands the science and sometimes catches it when I got it wrong. And then we also do a lot of organizing, because over time we've got to change the politics. We've got to change the politics so that nature and human beings are at least equal to corporate profits, if not superior. And then also we've been doing a lot of partnerships, not only with other organizations like the Conservancy today, but with our tribal communities, and we've tried to be as good allies as we can. So what do we need to know about the Talon mine? And this is actually, I think this was St. Croix 360 who did this map, and I just added the red arrows. And the red arrows are to show you the direction of flow of the surface water. And here are the things we need to know. What are the risks to rural, tribal, and downstream communities due to the potential for mining nickel from a massive sulfide mineralization? And that's their word for it. That means it's a highly concentrated ore body, highly concentrated toxic sulfide. And you see the arrows there going towards Big Sandy Lake? That goes towards the Mississippi River watershed. That's the flowage. And you see the arrows on the southern part of the property that Talon controls. That's going into the West Branch of the Kettle River, and then to the Kettle River, and then into the St. Croix River. So these are the two watersheds that have the potential to be affected by the Talon mine. And in addition to knowing what the risks are, I think it's really important to understand the track record of Minnesota agencies in regulating both taconite and sulfide mining. When I started doing this work, I'd come to a room full of really, really intelligent, sensitive people and then say, we don't want sulfide mining to be done in other countries where there's a poor quality of regulation. We want it done in Minnesota where everything is right. Well, to my shock actually, as well as disappointment. That's not what happens here. So I'm going to share with you some information about what really happens in Minnesota's regulatory environment, not just because I want to whine about it, because it means it's so much more important to get people involved at a community, a local, a township level from the bottom up to change that. And then I'm going to give you a little idea. I don't know as much as I'd like to know about these people, but who are the lead players? Who's really behind the Talon Metals project? And what are the political factors that are now influencing the regulatory process? And then I'm going to tell you right up front, we don't know very much about the Talon mine. We've been trying as a community to get all kinds of data on what they're going to do, what the quality of the minerals are, what's connection between the watersheds. That information hasn't been given to us, but I'm going to at least fact check some of the things that have been in the press to give you a better idea of what's likely to happen. And then finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about why it's important that you get involved and help build sort of a downstream community involvement and understanding of what this project could mean for the St. Croix River, the Kettle River, and this entire community. So what is sulfate pollution? It's really important. The reason they call this sulfate mining, we do, is because there's actually more sulfate coming out of those mines than there is ore. And that's not because someone's done something naughty, it's because that's the nature of the geology. The copper and the nickel are bound up as sulfide ores, and as that ore is blasted and pulverized and exposed to water, exposed to air, it forms sulfuric acid. Now, some areas like northern Minnesota are naturally low sulfur, low sulfate areas. And those areas have a very rich and biodiverse ecosystem naturally. And they also are really importantly for the tribal people, that's where wild rice thrives. Now, in Minnesota, taconite mines and coal plants today are the largest dischargers of sulfates. And if copper nickel sulfide ore mining were permitted, the level of sulfate from that kind of mining would be even greater than any of the sources that we have today in Minnesota. And so when we look at this is a picture, I think this was taken in Colorado. When we look at sulfide mining, we have to understand that there are inherent risks, and that unless in a water-rich environment, the track record of mitigating those risks is very poor. So here's the little red box. If you don't come away with anything, please know this. There have been people studying sulfide mining in the United States and Canada, not just in other countries where you can argue that they don't have good enough access to technology. That every sulfide mine in a water-rich environment like ours with lakes and wetlands has polluted either surface water, groundwater, or both, with acid mine drainage or toxic minerals. Question.
Characterize the Eagle Mine in Michigan. It is a nickel mine. It is in a water-rich environment. It has absolutely no violations. I take issue with the 100% figure there because I don't think that takes into account a place like Eagle.
Here's the interesting thing about the Eagle Mine. All of the communications that we get about the Eagle Mine talk about violations. There are exceedances of chemicals even at the Eagle Mine. Even more important, Eagle Mine is not the location where the processing of the ore occurs. That occurs at the Humboldt plant, which is miles away. And so when folks from the community up there in the Tamarack area went and took the tour, they insisted on going to the Humboldt mine as well. And that's where the ore is processed and turned into concentrates and tailings, and the level of environmental contamination from that processing is actually much more serious than from the mine itself. The other thing about the Eagle Mine that you need to realize is that that initial mine was very tiny, and they're only now beginning to try and get permits to vastly expand the size of the Eagle Mine. Now, I've talked to a national expert, Dr. Stephen Emmerman. He says, we're just beginning now to learn the extent of the pollution at the mine itself, but it is well recognized that the place where the ore is processed is a source of significant contamination. And so in the case of polymets, both would take place in the same watershed. In the case of the Talon mine, it seems that they're trying to use the same strategy as Eagle Mine and say it is actually pollution free because they may be exporting the pollution elsewhere, at least initially. So that's a really important distinction, is sometimes there's a small underground mine, it becomes a bigger underground mine. And there's the issue of both the processing of the ore as well as the initial excavation. So I think that if you look at that situation and you look at the Eagle Mine from that perspective, I think also Eagle Mine is a very different hydrology than what we have in Minnesota. But I don't know if this study considered the Eagle Mine, but the experts that I've talked to, who are national experts in mining, say it's not an exception. It is not going to tell us that Minnesota is going to be okay if we do the polymet mine or the twin metals mine or the Talon metals mine. Does that answer your question? Okay, good. And sometimes the mines do not actually result in acid mine drainage, because that means a very high level of sulfur. Sometimes it's important to realize that there's some metals like arsenic and lead and manganese and nickel that will leach out of the rock even at a pH that is only slightly lower than neutral. And so that sometimes there won't be this orange river, but so there might not necessarily be any visual evidence that there's pollution, but there still would be chemicals that would create risks. One of the really important things for Minnesota is to understand the role of sulfates that in wetlands and sediments. And they've done a lot of testing in Minnesota about the effects. And one of the things that happens, we all over America, and certainly in Minnesota, we have concentrations of inorganic mercury in sediments and lakes and in wetlands. And that a lot of that is a legacy of combustion from coal or from oil. And if there's no interaction with those inorganic mercury elements, they will stay in the sediment and they won't bioaccumulate and cause harm. And one of the problems of sulfate from sulfide ore mining is that it will increase the likelihood that bacteria, methylating bacteria, would transform inorganic mercury to organic mercury that bioaccumulates in the food chain. So we have methyl mercury. There can be a concentration in the predatory fish at the top of the food chain, like a walleye or a northern, that's 1 million times higher than would be a concentration in the water. And this is my favorite. It's, if you're a nerd, you're gonna love this. This was created by Amy Merkel, and she was working with friends at Boundary Waters. And this, if you look at the left side, the roots of that's wild rice roots. And they're white, and that means they're healthy. And one of the things that the taconite mining industry was trying to say is, we should allow lots of sulfate into the water because iron will bind with that sulfate, and then there won't be any harm to wild rice. So if you look on the right side, you can see the roots. This is a schematic, it's not a picture of the actual wild rice plant, but it represents very accurately that the roots will have black plaques on them that are sulfur and iron combined. And what that means is that the next generation, the wild rice plant won't get enough nutrients and the seeds will be small and they won't be healthy. And so wild rice will slowly get weaker and weaker and then decimate and become extinct. And then on the right side, you see, rather than staying in the sediments, P is phosphorus and there is nitrogen and Hg is short for mercury. That in an environment without sulfate in Minnesota lakes or rivers or wetlands, those chemicals will stay in the sediments. But if sulfate is added, and added at levels that are common with the kinds of pollution that we see from taconite mining or from sulfide mining in other states, it will double the amount of phosphorus released, double the amount of nitrogen released, double the amount of regular mercury that's released, and have a 6 times increase in the amount of methyl mercury. So you can see that sulfate itself, maybe it's not toxic, but it has interactions with the ecology. with the bacteria in the sediments that create a lot of complications for the ecology of lakes and rivers and streams. You can see that cute little fish, that's what we're eating. And they did a study in Minnesota, the Minnesota Department of Health did that in 2011. And they tested about 1,400 babies in newborns in the Lake Superior region. And they found that 10% of them had unsafe levels of mercury in their blood when they're born. And I asked a couple of the doctors who work with us up in Duluth, they said, what does that mean, unsafe? And one of the psychiatrists pointed out that that number that the health department was using came from the professional literature. It was the level at which statistically significant decreases in IQ began to take place. So if we do not control the amount of sulfate and mercury and bioaccumulation, we're actually putting the next generation's brain at risk in terms of IQ and also other disabilities. Okay, sulfide bond threats also include threats that relate to drinking water and air emissions. Now, those are probably primarily local, but I think we need to know about them because there's a rural community and there are indigenous people who live near the proposed Talon mine site. And drinking water contamination, many of the people in that area get their water from wells, and manganese is released from many other kinds of mining, not just the Talon mine, but historical taconite mines as well. And as little as 100 parts per billion can create neurological damage in children and also in the elderly. And arsenic, as you know, there's no safe level, and that's a potent carcinogen. And lead is also, there's no safe level, and that causes neurological harm, particularly in the developing brains of infants and children. And so if there is an impact of mining on wells where people get their drinking water, there will be relatively direct health effects. Another relatively direct health effect is from fugitive dust. And that could be from storing the ore, or it could be from processing. And this is a picture from another mine. And nickel is a carcinogen, primarily for lung cancer. And cadmium is also a carcinogen, both for lung and kidney disease. And particulates, even if they're not specifically carcinogenic, they increase the risk of both lung and heart disease and early mortality. So once again, this is going to be less important for us in Stillwater or in Twin Cities, but it's a real risk factor, not only for workers, but for people in the local communities. And now, one of the things I think we need to understand is that Minnesota mining would have a disproportionate effect, not only on low-income people who rely on wild rice and fish for sustenance, but on tribal communities that have treaty reserved rights to hunt, fish, and gather. So if you look at the orange blob on the left, that's the Duluth complex. And they call that a disseminated ore body, which means it's a relatively low-grade ore body. And that means it's less sulfur, but it also means that in order to get, let's put it this way, if you dig 100 tons out of the ground, less than 1 ton is going to be ore, and only a fraction of that is going to actually be metal. So what comes out of that process is much more than 99% waste. So we're thinking about, sometimes mining in Minnesota, taconite in a heyday would be large percentages, and even now at the lower level, taconite is sometimes 2%. But these are less than 1% across the board. So you can think about the huge piles of waste rock and tailings that would result from mining. And in the numbers there, polymet, twin metals, and Talon metals, that's just in the order of when they're likely to come forward. Polymet is the first proposed Minnesota mine. Twin metals is on hold now because of federal action on the leases and due to the impacts on the boundary waters. In Campbell's, you can see that is the next closest to the boundary waters. And Teck right now, you may have read about it, that Teck and Polymet are attempting to merge, and that Glencore, a notorious international company based in Switzerland that has revenues of about 200 billion with a B a year, that would be the company that would be the majority ownership of this new venture. So basically, the Teck project, the mine itself would be the boundary waters watershed, And the processing is likely to be in the Lake Superior watershed. So we would have Glencore, which has been convicted of bribery, corruption, all kinds of very challenging bad behavior, would be in charge of Minnesota's precious water resources, both towards the boundary waters and towards Lake Superior. Now you can see there's a little circle far off on the left. That is the Talon metals mine. And the Talon metal mine, as we talked about, would affect the St. Croix River watershed and the Mississippi River watershed. And there's also something that's really important. That ore body is not part of the Duluth complex. There may be some parts of that ore body that are disseminated or low grade, but much of that ore body is an older, different kind of geological formation and has a much higher level of sulfur and a much higher level of metal than at polymet or twin metals or any of the other mines. And so the risks of that mine are proportionally higher in terms of the degree of sulfur and sulfide mineralization. You can see the polygon, the little red line around on the right side. That is the boundary of the 1854 treaty area. And those were areas that the Ojibwe people had, and they were their land to hunt, fish, gather, and live. And they had made a treaty in 1854 with the United States government that they would live just in those tiny little burgundy spaces, and everything else the US government promised would be retained in a way that the tribes would just reserve the right to hunt, fish, and gather. Well, needless to say, if we poison the water, we tear down the forests, we poison the water, we make it impossible for wild rice to survive because of changes in water levels and sulfate, those reserved rights will disappear. So it's the boundary waters projects, the St. Louis River projects, the Lake Superior projects, they all affect treaty rights. And actually so does the Talon mine. And that is affecting, and there are a couple of reasons why. I'll show you on the next page. Look at this map based on the color, the darkness of the color red. This shows where is wild rice abundance? Where do people come to harvest? And even though wild rice used to be all the way across most of the heart of the United States, much of it has been destroyed by farming, by development, by our indifference. Minnesota remains actually the place in America that has the highest concentration, the highest survival of natural beds of wild rice. And the heartland for wild rice, what I call the wild rice basket, is in Aitkin County. That's that the darkest of the dark counties in the middle of North. It's just west of Duluth, maybe 50 miles. And that is the area that would be impacted by the Talon metals mine. And people come from all over, all the other reservations to harvest there. It's not just the local community. And then in addition, and this map on the right is created by Honor of the Earth, and it highlights that there's Sandy Lake Ojibwe community, there's a Minnewawa Ojibwe community, there's an East Lake Ojibwe community, and then the Mille Lacs community, which is actually trying to work with all of these communities together, because all of these communities have treaty rights and have a really important interest in the preservation of water and forests and wetlands. And I think I want to point this out, the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, we call it GLIFWIC by the initials. They've highlighted the history. The history in 1850, the United States government was trying to get out of their responsibility to pay money to the Indians and bring them provisions in compensation for having taken their land. And they attempted to undermine treaty payments and relocate the Ojibwe people. And as a result of this kind of manipulation, there were an estimated 400 deaths and they call it, we speak of it as the Sandy Lake tragedy, but it wasn't just a tragedy, it was actually a result of our government's unwillingness to honor their obligations. And so the significance of having a potentially very risky sulfide mine affecting the Sandy Lake community is not lost on anyone who knows that history, particularly Indigenous people. So what do we have here? I want to tell you a little bit about the Talon Metals mine itself. This picture in the purple, that's from one of the Talon Metals feasibility studies. And you look at the tadpole or whatever else you know of that swims, that has a tail and big body, might not be a tadpole. The part that is the biggest area of the mineralization known is actually south of Highway 210. In other words, the part that is likely to actually flow down hydrologically to the St. Croix is the big fat body of that tadpole. But most of the exploration is right up at the top, which may be the richest part, but is certainly the part that is going to be less politically problematic, because it would not affect the St. Croix River, it would not affect the Salem Marsh, it would not affect wild rice preserves. So that the initial exploration and much of the data that we have is only for exploration of a very small part of that deposit. And the words massive sulfide mineralization, I will emphasize, it's Talon Metals words, it's not my words. But one of the things to realize is that in addition to pollution, there's also a risk from any mine, not just their mine, of water drawdown. Because in order to mine, and particularly for an underground mine, you have to pump out all the water. And solid bedrock, the amount of water is not very great. But if you have fissures in the bedrock, the amount of water that would pour into the mine from those fissures is enormous. And the depth that they found mineralization for the Talon mine ranges from 3,400 feet to about 500 feet. And what that means, 500 feet is shallow enough so they might even try an open pit mine. And 3,400 feet is very deep, and there'd have to be a good deal of shaft and enclosure in order to go that deep. And we have no idea which parts of it are going to be the richest. We have no idea which parts of it they're going to mine. And we have no idea, even if they say they're going to start mining here, whether that will expand. Because the history, not only in Minnesota, but across the country, is that mines get a permit for a relatively small area and then they expand beyond that. And to realize, I think maybe I can pick up this map here. I'll be right back. This map, which it was in the earlier slide, and I can show it back again if you want to see it. All that crosshatched area reflects an area where Talon has leases. And where Talon has leases is about 31,000 areas of land control. And that's about the same size as, I'd say, 90% of Minneapolis. And the level of the length of the intrusion, what they call the Tamarack intrusion, the area where ore is likely, is about 18 kilometers. So however initially small their exploration area is, they have magnetic data, part of which was collected by the Minnesota government, showing a very expansive deposit, and Talon Metals has gotten control of a very large acreage because of that. And here are some of the surface water resources we've been talking about. This picture on the left is Sandy Lake. And Sandy Lake is a wonderful fishing lake, and there are people who have cabins there, and people who live there. But already that lake, because of surrounding agriculture, is impaired due to excessive nutrients. And towards the end of the summer, you see areas of algae in there. This is early in the spring, so it's a beautiful picture. And then here's a picture of the St. Croix River. And what you might not know is not only Minnewawa and Sandy Lakes up by Tamarack, but also the Kettle and St. Croix Rivers are impaired due to excessive mercury. And so pollution that would add sulfate and increase mercury and methyl mercury. Is this feedback? Oh, all right. That pollution that would increase mercury and methyl mercury would increase the problems in the Kettle River and the St. Croix River. And also, just to emphasize that the wild and scenic rivers of the Kettle River and the St. Croix are not only valuable to us, but they're valuable as a national resource. And the pollution, whether it includes increasing nutrients and potential for algae, or increasing mercury contamination of fish, so it's no longer desirable to fish there, that is a very big impact And the other thing I want to make it really clear, this is a hard to understand from back there, but everything that's purple there is a wetland area. And the lighter colored area is where the leases are. And that is also primarily an area of wetlands. So that the idea that somehow they can avoid, block off, control the impacts on water becomes much less likely when there are wetlands within and downstream of the mineral lease area. Also, there are lakes like Minnewawa, for example, that are very shallow wild rice lakes. So if there were going to be mine drawdown, it would affect those lakes because of the change in hydrology as well as the change in pollution. And one of the things that we've been making an issue of, in order to know whether a mine is going to have an impact on hydrology, you need to do a lot of testing. And you need to do special kinds of wells that test the interaction between the wetlands and the deeper rock. And Talon did one test. And it was, I didn't know, they did two tests, and both of them were very short term. And we looked at this issue for Polymet because Polymet also got away without doing that kind of testing and got their permits based on saying, we can use another pit located someplace else as an analogy. And we had an expert from Canada who wasn't working for the mines there. He said in Canada, they would have had to do dozens, if not hundreds of wells to identify what the threats were to wetlands and how to make sure that they were mitigated. So one of the things going forward, and I'm going to repeat again, we don't know enough about Talon for me to say, I know it's going to be harmful. But I can tell you, I know they are not doing the kind of testing for the interconnection between surface and groundwater that are necessary to know what the impacts are. And if they're doing the kind of testing of chemistry that would tell you what the risks are for pollution, even though the community has been asking for that repeatedly for the past 2 years, they are not sharing any of it. And so part of this comes down to who do you trust? And I grew up in Minnesota, other than when I went away to college, and I always thought we should trust Minnesotans, that we were really something special. I think, is that mine? Sorry about that. I remember this beautiful Time magazine cover with Governor Wendell Anderson advocating for the good life in Minnesota. And I believed in that. And if you were a fan of Garrison Keillor, I like to believe that we were like Lake Wobegon and all of our children were really above average and all of our regulators were above average and all of our laws were above average. And what I found out in the last 14 years is this is not really true. Other countries have stronger regulations for mining than we do in Minnesota. For example, there's something called an upstream dam, which is what Polymet is proposing, where you build your dam, which is made out of sand, on top of other sand rather than on top of the ground, the bedrock. And it's well recognized that that is less stable than if you build a downstream dam, which you build on the stronger surface. Other countries like Brazil, Peru, Chile, and Ecuador, they say it's illegal to build an upstream dam. And if you have one that was built a long time ago, you have to decommission it. Well, Minnesota just approved one for Polymet, not in the 1950s, in 2018. Now, what we found is that overall, Minnesota Department of Natural Resources and even our Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, they approve whatever the company proposes. And if you go into their meetings, they talk about customers. And you think, oh yeah, that's me. I'm a citizen. I care about clean water. I'm the customer. No, they see the applicants for permits as the customers, not the citizens, and certainly not nature itself. And even, well, this is something really important for Talon. We really discovered it with two different cases. That if you start out with a project and you expand it, the Minnesota courts are not going to require you to go back and do a new environmental study when you expand, when you change something. Because that's the myth I always had, is that don't worry if they approve a small permit. If they decide to do something bigger, we get to start over and we can stop it. The answer is, once the camel's nose is in the tent, that whole camel's coming in. And that's what happens in Minnesota, whatever you think the rules actually say. And also what we learned, and this is about the Milestone 7, I don't know if you've read about it, they've got a proposal to expand the size of their dam right on Lake Superior, North Shore. The initial permit for that said it had to be a downstream dam, the least dangerous kind. When the company started saying, no, we want to do something cheaper, namely the upstream dam, our Minnesota Department of Natural Resources allowed them to change the kind of dam, even though the only environmental study was of the safer one. Didn't do a public notice, they didn't do an amendment, it's just in their documents, and the only reason we found out about it is because one of the reporters from the Duluth News Tribune said, "Hey, where is this memo?" I said, "What are you talking about?" And that is something that we have to be aware of, is that we think that once you've got it done right at the beginning, it's gonna stay okay. It's gonna stay the safe technology. The way it really works, anything can change behind closed doors, and you won't even necessarily know. And the other thing, this is really important. In the case of Twin Meadows, there were tribal staff who were trying to find out the real data about pollution. What we found out is that Twin Meadows didn't give that to the government in Minnesota, because the government has a law that even if they dig around and they take a lot of time, eventually they have to give it to you as the public. So what they did, the DNR just let Twin Meadows hold on to their data. So even up to even as the process was moving along, the public, the environmental groups and the tribes did not have the full range of water quality data. And for the Talon mine, based on what's happened so far, I think we need to watch for the same thing happening. Because unless the community, and that means the tribal community, the members of the public, environmental groups, citizen scientists have that data, there's no way to double check. There's no way to evaluate risks. So it's really important. I mean, I'm telling you right now, I don't have the data from Talon, but I'm telling you also that we're going to have to be watchdogs to make sure that someone does, and that there'll be scientists and hydrologists and chemists who can really look at that independently. Yeah.
I just would like to know that Talon has not submitted their mine operation plan. They've not applied for a permit yet. So that's why this is not available information.
Yes and no. I mean, Talon, okay, the question was, is there a reason why Talon has given any information because they haven't applied for a permit? And the answer is yes and no. Talon has made all kinds of representations about their mine to investors for years. And as a result, Talon is required to file with the stock exchange detailed reports, technical reports on the mine. And these reports are very laudatory about financial opportunities and absolutely uninformative about the questions that we are asking, which are about risks. Also, under the Tamarack water lines, which is this kind of a network of volunteer citizens, started talking to Talon 2 years ago. Talon said, we are doing all kinds of sampling and monitoring, and we'll share all the information with you. And so they made a representation that they were going to be open and transparent, and then simply didn't. So number one, they are being open and transparent to the people who are the real stakeholders, who are the investors. And they promised to be open and transparent to the community. But in fact, that has not happened. And I think, based on what I know from the Climate Project, and what was sort of in their last December 22nd, 2022, or maybe it was November, their last study, their last technical report, they referenced a whole lot of environmental work that they were doing. They described it for the investors. They did all this environmental work with no data. Now, after working with Climate on the Climate Project now for 14 years, if they're describing for an investor, they can't say we did the testing and that's not true. So there are huge reams, numbers of data, and where that we could show a hydrologist, we could show a chemist, we could show a geologist, and they could make some analysis. We just haven't been able to get it. When I say we, I don't mean Paula McAfee and Water Legacy. I mean the people who actually live there have been trying to get that information. So I know it's there. because they told their investors it's there, and that has to be true. And I know that we don't have it because whether it's the tribal communities or the Tamarack Water Alliance or the next door neighbors, everyone's asked for it and we don't have it yet.
I guess what I'm saying is that when they apply, when they actually submit the mine plan of operation and submit for a permit, that is when data is then more available.
Yes,
So,
it
and
may be.
so then it's a huge process to put those things together.
Here's a couple of different points, and the question, the statement was made that when they make an application they start the process, they will make the information available. In the case of the Twin Metals permit, they started the environmental review process without sharing the information about the technical data. And the reason that's important, and this is going to likely to happen sometime this year, when Talon comes forward with their project, they get to define it however they want to. They can say, oh, we're just doing this tiny little thing. And the community has a very limited amount of time to say, oh, no, you need Mr. DNR, Pollution Control Agency, Army Corps of Engineers, whoever the agencies are involved, you need to make them study whatever the potential project is. The problem is that if they've been holding their cards to the vest, you and any scientists that live in your community and any scientists who you're going to hire won't have data. They will be relying only on what Talon wants you to know. And that's what happened with Twin Metals. So that's what happened with Parliament. So that's one of the, once again, I don't know whether that's what Talon is going to do. What I do know is that the other mines in Minnesota have done that. And the state has been reluctant to require that the mining companies provide information to the state so that we can get it under the Data Practices Act. So this is a very real phenomenon, that this is a very difficult process for citizens, even if we have all the information. And if we have someone on the other side who's powerful and sophisticated and also not sharing the information, it becomes very difficult for communities to protect rivers like the St. Croix. Now, here's an example. Here's an example that has made me a cynic. I used to be a much more naive and hopeful human being. I loved the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. I advocated for their budgets. And when I found out in the case of mining, it's like a third rail. It's that even the people who are really careful and good scientists, they are influenced by a lot of political pressure and legislative pressure. And when we found out, and we've proven in court, and both the district court and the Court of Appeals have already found this is a fact, it's no longer just Water Legacy says, that the MPCA had a campaign that was a secret until we got discovery, and it was to prevent EPA from sending the polymet permit comments to the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. And it was during the time of the Trump administration, and they convinced the political leadership in the region of the EPA not to submit the comments. And all of the scientists and the managers in the water division opposed that. They said our process, our law, our standard operating procedure is if we think a permit doesn't satisfy the Clean Water Act, we say so, we put it in writing. And that didn't happen in the Polymet case. And our Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, who had always been my heroes, they destroyed official records in violation of statutes and manuals and common law. And this has been agreed not only by our courts, but also the EPA Inspector General that also said the EPA, and under the Trump administration, failed to follow its own procedures as well. And so this is a cartoon by Sack, who was recently retired, unfortunately. And these guys are saying, what? They're already digging the Polymet mine? And the answer is no, they're just burying the EPA comments that oppose it. And so this is a cautionary tale. I think next time there simply will be no records, so we won't be able to prove this kind of thing. But I think I would say there's always a silver lining, because I think one of the reasons that we've had the opportunity to wait for to stop the Polymet project while we look at its legal adequacy and sufficiency is because the agency overstepped the line here. And so the DNR permit to mine has been reversed, and we just finished a contested case hearing on one of the aspects of reclamation proposed. The water pollution permit has been reversed about dealing with seepage in the Clean Water Act. And the Supreme Court is still deciding what to do with the rest of the case. And the US Army Corps Wetlands Destruction Permit was suspended primarily due to the initiative and work of the Fond du Lac Band. So now I've sort of laid the table that there are real risks that are possible, not proven yet, I would say possible. We have a history of our government not being the kind of tough, fair regulator that we always thought it would be. And now what do we know about the actors who are responsible for the Tamarack nickel mine? The Talon metals we don't know very much about. It's very hard to find information, other than that it's based in the British Virgin Islands. And it's a mineral exploratory company. One of my board members explained that what they do is they're like a property flipper. They go in, they get the permits, and then somebody else does the actual mining. And then somebody else is likely to be Rio Tinto because that's their partner in this. And I have a picture. There's this huge Rio Tinto mine in Salt Lake in Utah County. Is usually not the hub of environmentalism, but even in that area, this is an area of project has had a huge amount of environmental concern because it provides 1/4 of 1% of the jobs in Salt Lake and Utah counties, but 30% of the total pollution, which is 10 times more than the next most polluting source, which is an oil refinery. So it gives you some idea of scale. And I don't know if people were aware of this 2 years ago. There was some discussion in the news that in Australia, Rio Tinto has a big iron mine there, and they had found ancient Aboriginal treasures, 46,000 years old. And what they did is before those Aboriginal sites could be documented, could be listed, could be protected, they just went in and bulldozed them. So it doesn't give, once again, we don't have proof they're going to do that in Minnesota, but we have to look at the track record as evidence of future performance. And none of these lines of evidence give us confidence that we're going to be protected in Minnesota. And so what do we actually, I've been talking a lot about what we don't know about the Talon Metals nickel mine. Some of the things we do know, do know that this one's going to be really profitable. Polymet's feasibility analysis, even its most recent one in 2018, the level of profits is going to be about 10 or 11%. Not very high for a mine. For Talon, if they use the sulfide nickel processing for electric vehicles, about 37.6%, pretty good. And if they didn't use that kind of processing, but just use the nickel for steel, the least processing costs, about 56%. So these are high rates of profit, and also an indication that nickel sulfate is not the only potential use of that mine. The mineralization, now once again, they're probably focusing in their presentations on the richest areas, but there are areas with as much as 10% ore, and areas where there are 80 to 90% of sulfide. And the eventual size of the mine, I want to highlight, we have no idea. We have no idea whether it will be only underground or just initially underground and then also open pits. We don't know where the mine shafts are being located. We don't know for how long ore will remain on the site, because usually they don't put the ore back into their mine shaft, into the underground mine until all the mining is done in that direction, because otherwise you won't be able to get to the farthest extent. And even if they do try and put the ore back underground, which is a relatively good practice, usually you can get about 50% of it back. So the question of how much ore there's going to be and where it will be stored and for how long, completely unknown. We don't know anything about the actual chemistry of the ore and the wastes. And that means not just the nickel, but what else is in there in terms of arsenic or lead or manganese or other toxic chemicals, no knowledge. And we don't know, there's one report, I think it was about 2 years ago, it talked about a major influx at 2 different points in the mine shaft. I think it was they're about 500 or 300 feet down. And what that usually means, the mine talks about it, it's important in terms of how much they're going to have to pump out. In terms of community, it's important for how much is going to be dewatered. But that is usually a location of fractures. And so we don't, it's very important to know not only the connection between wetlands and the ground and then bedrock, but also where are the fractures and will they be intersected at a point where there'll be a huge amount of loss of the water table. Now, here's an update, and the update is in January 23 for the first time. The Chief Exploration and Operations Officer of the company, Brian Golder, excitedly told his investors that Tamarack intrusive complex has district scale potential. And what that means is sort of the first admission that this is not going to be that Talon is saying what we had suspected is that this mine is not likely to be just that initial location. More recently, they have had exploration that's even further north in this area that is showing as a project site. But when you look at this huge tadpole and you look at the project site, there are a lot of experts who are concerned that the application for environmental review that they're going to do is going to be this tiny portion of the intrusion, and that the regulators won't have the foresight to study what will happen if the entire district scale deposit is mined. And that is one of the things that the experts are telling us. We've got to be on top of that to make sure that they actually analyze the whole project. And in that reference, I think this is the most troubling thing for me of everything I've told you, is that the United States government has already told Talon they will make a grant of $114 million in order to do processing in North Dakota. Now, initially, you'd think, oh, this is great because North Dakota's dry, Minnesota's wet. But that's not true about this site. The site that they're proposing is actually in Indian country near the Missouri River. And that's because you need to have a high volume of water in order to process. It's not, because they're targeting the tribe. And also, what experts are telling us is that even if you could process remotely, that's just 475 miles away, and ship by rail to that location for a very small amount of ore, that's not likely to be feasible as if the mine expands. And the reason for that is that just the sheer volume of ore is like 33 to 35 times more than if you had the concentrates and you just transported the concentrates. So there are not only costs involved and carbon equivalent differences in how much you have to combust in order to transport, but there are actually logistics. I mean, are there enough trains going at the right time? Or this Burlington Northern Railroad, at least the people who know something about railroads are telling me that the potential that they would have insufficient capacity is very significant. And I want to say that I've been reading every single technical report that Talon's put out for the last 6 or so years. And each new report shows increased mineral resources. And since 2014, the amount of what they call inferred resources or committed resources, those have tripled. So that each time, and from the point of view, if you're an investor, if you have money in this mine, that's all really good news. Okay, that means your stock is worth more. So it's good news for you. But in terms of understanding the scope of the mine, it means that the scope is expanding and we don't know how big it's going to go. And the biggest concern I think I would have to say is that there is a commitment of in the communication strategy, in the politics, and even in the grant of a very large amount of money. And there still hasn't been any environmental review, any tribal consultation, or any permits issued. So this is putting the cart way before the horse, and in a way that may foreclose a candid and objective evaluation of the risks and the benefits. So one of the questions I get, and this is an important question, I don't think it's poorly intentioned, I think it's real, should we just go ahead anyhow because we need nickel in order to prevent climate crisis? And I think the real question is, do we really know whether nickel and electric vehicles is needed for the future? And first, we have a board member who is a scientist who used to work for 3M. And her perspective is that we don't know whether nickel will be needed. That right now, Tesla and China and Japan are all using a new kind of battery, which is a lithium battery, unfortunately, but it uses iron and phosphorus rather than cobalt and nickel and manganese. And they're doing it partially because it's less toxic, but mostly because iron and phosphorus are much more common. And so this is kind of a transitional technology, and the three vehicles there, the Tesla, which is the Model 3, which is sort of their every person's car to the extent Tesla has one, and the Ford Mustang and the Ford F-150 electric vehicles, those are all what they call LFP, lithium ferrous phosphorus batteries, which are not only cheaper, and they don't lose as much charge when they're cold, but they're less likely to ignite, which is kind of a nice thing. If you saw any of the footage from the floods in Florida where the Teslas burned and burned, I think even an LFP battery has some risks in that area. But there are also many new technologies. There's a development that could be the next one, which is sodium batteries. And that would reduce not only the toxicity of nickel mining, but the toxicity of lithium mining. And there are some advocates that say that actually none of the battery technology is the best technology, and we should be moving to fuel cells. And there have been huge advances in fuel cells, and in Europe and also in California, there are buses and trains that are using fuel cells. So I completely agree that we need to move away from fossil fuels, but whether nickel is essential to do that or is actually not the direction the technology is going, I think we don't know. And it would be a shame to risk our water and our wetlands basically forever when there may be another technology coming on in just a matter of a few years that will better address the need to move away from fossil fuels. And here I want to say two different points. I have not seen an agreement with the contract with Tesla. It's not publicly available. But what Talon told everybody is that this agreement requires that there be production by 2026. Now we're in the middle of 2023. Environmental review is not started. So unless everybody cuts every corner known to humankind in a way that is immoral and as well as unprecedented, there won't be actual nickel coming out of the Talon mine in 2026. And it might not even be desirable from their point of view, because they are still finding new sources of high level nickel when they do exploring. Now that doesn't mean this mine won't take place, because at the profits that they disclosed in their technical report were really good and strong, whether or not they moved in the direction of climate change and EVs. But it means that the argument, the I'm saving the world by mining argument, becomes a little bit weaker. And then I think this is something that, as a lawyer, I know this is obvious, as a regular person, it might not be. The Department of Natural Resources can't issue a permit saying, I'm letting you mine, but only if that metal goes for helping us solve the climate crisis. Once there's a permit to mine, they can sell it to anyone they want to at any price they want to. That's the way our system of economics works, because once they have a permit, they have, as long as they're not violating any laws or creating an environmental catastrophe, they have the right to use that ore the way they see fit. So if we think that somehow, because they tell us today, I'm going to use it for X purpose, that's going to be what it is used for, it will be used for whatever is the most economically sensible for them at the time. And I'm not even disagreeing with that. That's the way our economic system is set up. But I don't want people to be naive and think that if we sacrifice wild rice and the tribal communities and the St. Croix River, what we're going to get out of it is a reduction in climate crisis, because we may get all the harm and none of the above. So what does that mean right now? What that means is that we have to trust ourselves. I mean, we have to be the solution. We can't just say, oh, we love the Pollution Control Agency, or we love the administration in Washington, or we love the Department of Natural Resources, because they really do a great job on fisheries. They absolutely do. We can't rely on others, because the power and the money behind mining is so significant and so concentrated. It's not like a lot of other industries where there are a lot of small industries all over and they're dispersed. There are very few large mining companies. They're all global and they all are very, very powerful, whether it's Rio Tinto or Augusta or Glencore. It's a handful of industry that is really calling the shots. And we do know that Talon Metals has said they will begin environmental review sometime in 2023. That is still likely to be the case. We know that that process allows public comments before the agency determines the scope of study. We know that in the case of many projects, the public is not activated or knowledgeable until much, much longer, much after the scoping study. And the scoping study sets the limit. If you come in later and you say, well, you guys should have studied this, the chance of it getting studied is almost none. We had doctors and nurses, more than 30,000 across Minnesota, say we want to have a health impact assessment of polymit. And what our governor and all our agencies said, it's too late. Should have done that way a long time ago, like 10 years ago when we didn't even know about the project. And so it's really important that at the time of the scoping, when they first propose it, that we have the community involved, and we also have the resources to get some experts. Get some experts to say, no, you have to study the interaction of groundwater and surface water. Or no, you can't assume it's going to stay a tiny little mine because that's not what the minerals tell you. And so we also want to try and, start from the grassroots up and make sure that your representatives, whether they're local representatives or talking to your senator and your representative at Congress and as well as at the state legislature. I will tell you, Water Legacy doesn't lobby. I don't have the time, and there are other groups who are really good at that. The Friends of the Boundary Waters does some really important lobbying, and they have approved the first bill. Guess what? They've been working on that for 3 years. Not only haven't they passed that bill, nobody in the legislature has let them even have a hearing. Can you imagine that? You have, there had 30 co-sponsors, many people who said this is a good idea. Maybe when you've had a vote, they'd say, no, not ready yet. But we haven't even had a hearing. This subject of mining is so taboo that the legislature won't even let experts or citizens talk about it. They won't let anyone take a vote on it because they don't want to be on record. And so one of the things that we need to do from the grassroots is we have to make this a subject of conversation. It can't be a secret topic, because if it's a secret topic, only the mining industry will be heard. So I think this is a critical decision period. I know the Conservancy knows folks in the community. I see local officials here. I see activists. It's time to talk to people and say, we may have this thought that this mining problem took place someplace else, maybe in Colorado, not in Minnesota, or maybe up north, but not in an area that affects us. But the truth is that unless we're very careful, we might lose what's the most important resource Minnesota has. The resource that we can't replace, which is the clean water needed for life. And not just the life of the wild rice or the life of the fish, but our own lives and the healthy brains of our kids. So please sign up today. If you sign anything over there, both of us, Katie and I will copy it. We'll all get that information. And I would like your questions. And I'm real comfortable. If you think what I'm saying is not correct, I like your comments too, because that's how we learn. We hear from all sides. So please, comment, question, whatever. Yes.
Here, I'll bring the microphone over. Thanks. So just as briefly as possible, can you legally, the relationship between the federal government and the tribes? And then how is it that, well, what happens then when the EPA has essentially empowered the state agencies to supposedly do stuff? So how does that impact all this?
This is really an important question. The EPA has federal jurisdiction over direct sources of pollution like wastewater discharge. And their obligation to comply with the Clean Water Act and to supervise the state is even independent of the fiduciary relationship of the tribes. But both the EPA and the United States Army Corps of Engineers also have a responsibility under Section 404, also of the Clean Water Act, to protect wetlands. And all of these mines in Minnesota affect wetlands. And so the Army Corps of Engineers and the EPA are supposed to review and make sure that the projects do not degrade wetlands. Now, for the tribes and the state, there's something else in addition, and that's called certification. And the state, they have the right, it's called 401 certification, to object if a federal permit for wetlands will cause a violation of state standards. And what the Pollution Control Agency has chosen to do is interpret their authority much more narrowly than they have to under the Clean Water Act. So they only comment on wetlands mitigation or stream mitigation. And sometimes their comments are helpful and they get better stream mitigation, replacements. If you damaged a floodplain here, you have to fix it here. So it's not that it's without value, but it simply doesn't ask the really hard question is your destruction of wetlands going to hurt my water quality? This is one of the articles that I wrote with the help of Nancy Schultz and Margaret Watkins, who are tribal staff of the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa, and the Fond du Lac Band of Grand Portage. And the Grand Portage Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa. And they were sort of my advisors on this because when I first got into this work, I read the Clean Water Act and said, it looks like a tribe could actually object to a bad permit. And every environmental group, including national groups, said absolutely, absolutely not. And I talked to Nancy at Fond du Lac and Margaret at Grand Portage, and they said, I think you're reading this right. And so I consulted with them when I wrote the article for William Mitchell Law Review, and Nancy Schultz has connections all over the country. She took it to Indian country everywhere, and she met with the EPA, and then it was sort of agreed before the Trump administration that the Army Corps, when there was a permit, that the EPA would do the procedural step of telling the tribes as well as telling the state you have an opportunity to object. And it wasn't a promise that they were going to support the objection, but just that the procedure would be done and be done right. Guess what? The Fond du Lac chair kept writing letters to the EPA under Trump saying, we know we're supposed to get information here, we're not supposed to. They didn't give one. And a very conservative US District Court judge, they sued, the Fond du Lac band sued, saying, listen, even if you don't going to decide our way, you have to give us a procedure right. A very conservative judge said, yes, absolutely. The law says the EPA has to give the tribes notice. And then the tribe did their own analysis using good science and said, we have concluded that the destruction of wetlands that will result from the Polymet project and the sulfate release, etc., is going to affect our downstream mercury standard. Because the Fond du Lac Band has a very stringent mercury standard. They're on the St. Louis River, and all the Polymet project is at the headwaters of the St. Louis River. And that was pretty impressive that the tribe had made that determination. But the really, I would say, historic thing was not only that they did that, but that the EPA would. The EPA initially said we're going to look into it, and then they agreed that the Polymet project would affect the downstream water quality standards of the Fond du Lac Band on their own reservation. And that hearing took place last 2022, almost a year ago in May and June. Water Legacy and a lot of people testified, and then we did, I don't know, as usual, a complete overkill of every law in the world and every fact in the world, assuming that this is going to end up in court. We haven't heard. And to the best of my knowledge, the band hasn't heard what's going to happen with that decision. According to the law, The EPA is the expert on water quality. The Army Corps is supposed to defer to them. The statute says that, and the case law says that. Politics don't say that, so who knows? Really good question, really long answer, but I really think that's super important because that was something so historic that one of our tribes did.
It seems like copper sulfide mining proposals are like a whack-a-mole game. Where one pops up and we try and deal with it, another one pops up and we try and deal with it, now we have a third one and I'm sure there will be other ones. You mentioned that approve it first proposed legislation. Can you talk more about that and how that might solve that issue?
The Prove It First proposal is a brave attempt to actually change the rules of the game. And instead of having us on the outside trying to prove that Polymet lied or Talon doesn't have a good project, the mine would actually have to come forward and say, it's been done here, it's been closed, and it works. I think that's one approach. The other approach is I think we need to change the politicians and the politics. So if you know people of high energy, good moral character who are willing to be public servants, do everything you can to encourage them, because I think you need to have a change, not just in what we propose, but in the people who are going to make the decisions. And the reason we're getting bad decisions from our agencies is because the politicians are telling them, this is the outcome we want. And if your science is telling you something else, you have two choices. Shuffle your science into a drawer or shuffle yourself into another job. So I think we really, I've been talking about the agencies, but I think the problem is the politics. So I agree with the Prove It First principle, but I think it's something more fundamental. And it's something more fundamental that we need to make. Did I just do that? I didn't intend to do that. Something more fundamental about our country that we need to talk about is what do we stand for? What do we stand for and what do we want to do?
So Paula, there's 4 laws that are in committee that are proposed. So there's the bad actor law, there's, could you talk about the 4 of them?
I can talk a little bit about it. The bad actor law is an attempt to try and say, what kind of companies do we want to be doing business in is that? Yeah. What kind of companies do you want to have doing business in Minnesota? I think it's a good conversation to have. I think it's going to be hard to figure out which are really bad actors and which aren't. But I think the basic principle that when we have a foreign corporation coming into Minnesota that has a history of criminality, I mean, with Glencore, it's completely unambiguous that there should at least be a different process than if we have U.S. Steel trying to do with another taconite mine. One of the other attempts in the law that is being proposed is right now the Department of Natural Resources has a very confused mission. They're supposed to be protecting our natural resources, and they're also supposed to be promoting mining. And when Commissioner Landwehr was first appointed, he did a continuing legal education for a bunch of us lawyers. And he said, if you think that I'm going to stop the Polymet mine because I've had a background in environment, you're wrong. The law doesn't permit me to do that. I mean, his perception was that the law might permit him to tinker around the edges on the technology. And part of that is, because of the actual substantive law, but also because the Department of Natural Resources depends for a very substantial portion of its funding on royalties from mineral leases. So it's actually, if you're saying, Department of Natural Resources, please say no to this mine, or say, Department of Natural Resources, please say no to your own budget for the next 50 years or so. And that's not the way we should be making our decisions. The promotion or tax collection or royalty collection should be separate from decisions on how to regulate and preserve resources. They're both, you could say they're both perfectly legitimate government functions, but they should be separate. So the question of regulation is not contaminated. Those are the ones I know about. There may be others, but that's the ones I know about.
The 4th one had to do with the company needs to accumulate the money for mitigation as it runs and keep it in the shell corporation, so that if the shell corporation goes bankrupt, then nothing's done with the mine.
Oh, this is, I know, that's very helpful, Craig, because I wasn't aware of that law, but I want to tell you. People think financial assurance is going to protect Minnesotans if these mines go bad. That is not the way the laws are written. There's one issue that Craig has raised, which is that where the money is kept and how it's kept, and is it front loaded enough so that the company can't just mine the richest stuff and then walk away leaving the piles of lower grade? Very legitimate issue. But something else I want to let you know, financial assurance is only for planned reclamation. I'm gonna say it again, financial assurance is only for planned reclamation. It is not for if your dam fails and you pollute St. Louis River. It is not for if your mine seeps and it kills fish or results in high levels of manganese that have health risks. Financial assurance is for expected and planned things that one needs to do to mitigate harm. It is not a protection if something bad happens, if something goes wrong. And the EPA was going to put into law before the Trump administration a financial responsibility bill that would be that every mine would have to put in, so it was like a self-taxing. It was shut down, and that was the result of, I think it was Earth Justice did 10 years of litigation. It had finally been tested, brought to the end, and it was killed in just a few months of the other administration. So if something happened at a mine that had a shell corporation, you and I as taxpayers would be on the hook, not the parent company, and certainly not the mine that went bankrupt.
Any other questions?
I just have a minor question. My brain is pickled.
This is what I do for fun.
What was my question? I think what I asked about. Oh, is the mining area in Minnesota part of the Canadian Shield? And are they doing similar mines up in Canada? And what has been the result of that?
Oh boy, I don't know enough about the geology to know whether there's something similar in Duluth, the Duluth complex. Maybe Craig would know that answer. But I will tell you that there's a lot of mining in Canada, and it has a very mixed track record as well. So I don't think, I think this is an international problem. It's not, you know. My concern about Minnesota is not that we're worse than everyone else, but that we tell ourselves that we're so much better, and we really aren't. I don't think Minnesota is worse than other countries or other states. It's just that we have a myth that we're safe because we are so much fairer and smarter and tougher. And we're doing what everybody else is doing. We're letting people run roughshod over our resources.
It strikes me a little bit that the question is, you know, is this really an issue of the standards that we do have, or their enforcement? Because we do have existing very, very high standards in existence that were arrived at several years ago, but in terms of non-ferrous mining have never been used because we haven't had non-ferrous mining.
Well, let me just say that this is exactly what I'm talking about. People who are just regular citizens, all including me, thought we had really tough standards. We don't. I know what's in every single one of those rules. I've read them, and I've read the history, and I've read the transcripts, and I've read everything. They were a compromise where most of the people in the room were mining companies in the 1980s, when people knew so much less than they knew today. When people knew so much less about things like sulfate and how it affects mercury. And most of those rules, they're all about discretion. There's nothing that says you can't have an upstream dam, or you can't destroy more than this amount of wetlands, or you can't have an online tailings basin, or you have to have a cover for your mine waste that is only allows 3 millimeters of percolation. Now, all of those things I just said, they're all achievable under today's technology, today's standard. They're not in any of our rules. And our statutes, which are even older, our statutes are all about encouraging mining. So no, we do not have good standards. We have a huge amount of discretion, and we have a huge amount of political pressure, even when there are people in our agencies who really know better if they were just allowed freedom to say, wrong technology, wrong treatment. They aren't given that freedom. But I think one of the things that we need to realize also is that our Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, at least since I've been doing this work, which is 14 years, they're not enacting more stringent standards. They're trying to roll back and get rid of the standards we have. For example, specific conductivity. What is that? It means a whole bunch of ions are in the water, and what it means is it's going to kill sensitive fish and sensitive little critters. They call them benthic macroinvertebrates, but they're little critters. And that was a rule that was developed in the 1970s to prevent destruction of agriculture. And only in like 2011 was the first study that the EPA did that showed this same ionic pollution, it killed fish. Some of the lakes and streams that we have where the fish were disappearing or were generally disappearing was because of these ionic pollutants. Well, guess what? Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, they repealed that standard. And that is now something that the tribes are litigating, and we're sort of waiting to see whether or not we're going to join them in the litigation. But the tribes are litigating that at the federal level, because even though we spent a year and a half, citizens, tribes, experts saying this is a really bad idea. There was so much pressure from the industry to get rid of those standards, so that's what the Pollution Control Agency did. And they almost got rid of the wild rice sulfate standard. I mean, I spent 12 years working with tribes in the agencies, the legislature, the courts, and we finally have got that saved. But the agency, Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, was trying to get rid of that standard. One of the few bulwarks that we have remaining to protect us from pollution. No, our standards for mining are low, and our water quality standards, it's not only that they're not enforced, but there's an active attempt, and some of it has been very successful to get rid of them.
Hey, yeah, I would like to speak from an experience perspective to, this idea that Minnesota has these strong regulations and permitting system. As a very recent example is the Line 3, now called 93 pipeline, which was permitted under the strictest, the most enforceable, strong regulatory process, supposedly, right? And we now have a Line 393 pipeline that we as community volunteers have documented all 10 major impacts from construction alone, impacts to our wetlands, our waters. This is big aquifers, exactly, the breaches that our state is not disclosing, but community volunteers are disclosing. So I used to believe that too, Paula. I really did about this state, and I was so proud of it. And if you've been in this system as a concerned community person, you are pretty quick to discover every single thing that scientists, the communities, that tribes warned of about Line 3, just in construction, we are seeing on the ground, out in the field. So no, we cannot trust these safeguards in Minnesota. I'm just sorry to say, but it's from a personal experience.
And I can't underscore how important it is when citizens get out and do their own monitoring. And that has been, one of the important lakes on the edges of the boundary waters that has been affected by the closed Duncan mine and also by the North Shore mine. And has, is impaired due to excessive sulfate that has reduced wild rice in the areas closest to the sources of pollution and has increased mercury contamination even beyond that. It was not listed as a wild rice impaired water because it's right next to North Shore's doors. And so citizens, the Northern Lakes Science Advisory Panel and Northeastern Minnesota's for Wilderness and the 1854 Treaty Authority, they did the sampling. Now, eventually, because all these community groups did the sampling this year, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency themselves went out and sampled, and I believe they did a good job, so I'm not. But it was the community, the volunteers, who learned the techniques and the science and got the labs and all the rest of it, and pushed the ball forward to protect the water. And this is a really, the tribes tell me this is a really big deal, because if you have a water that's listed as impaired for sulfate and you stop polluting it, that over time, the wild rice can restore itself because there's seeds in the sediment. So there's a good, if we were actually to do the things we pretend we're doing, to follow the rules and enforce the laws and sample and monitor when it's not working, we could actually improve things. It's not that they have to stay bad. It's that I think what Jackie's doing and what the Line 3 volunteers are doing is saying, we're going to take care of our own nature if you don't, because we are the stakeholders. We are the guardians. We are the water protectors and the protectors of the animals and plants that are part of our community. So I guess that's the two places I want to see before, I don't want to miss the two places where I've seen hope. One is when citizens get involved and they monitor and they come up with a science, not just petitions, but actually get involved, or they run for office, which is magic. And the other is that Minnesota courts have been what has, in the case of the Parliament, they've been a place that has listened to the evidence. Not 100%, not always, but there's still in Minnesota, there are judges and courts that will listen to the law and actually try and fix things that have gone wrong.
We have time for one more question if anyone wants to chime in.
Or comment.
Or comment.
I think there's someone back there who's protecting water who wants to say something.
No, just thank you.
Yeah, I would just like to thank everyone. This is a listening session. We're getting information out there on something that, if it marches according to the timeline, could happen so fast that there's no time to respond. And so what we want is people to be aware, because the negative consequences would be far-reaching. The conversation is what's important. We need to be talking. We need to allow the scientists to have their say, do the studies, and really we need our legislators to step up and do their job.
And if you have any contacts with people, even if it's smaller communities or your legislators, there are people who actually want to listen to science, want to hear both sides, want to have hearings on COVID first, even if we're not ready to vote on it. And want to know that there's someone who cares about the water, because let me tell you, the other side is knocking on their door day and night, is in their face. And so if they would like to hear, they would want to hear, not from me, but from a regular person who says, I care about the St. Croix and I don't want you to just jump into this. I want you to get the science. Or, and so please don't underestimate your own potential. Sometimes people who are just, that's my friend, or I know her from church, or I've been, our kids went to the same school. That's probably more of a better than me waltzing into their office. Okay? So what you can do is really important, and conversation. Craig, you're absolutely right. The more people are having the conversation about potential risks and what Minnesota needs to do and what we are and are not successful, the more likely we are to be moving the needle in the right direction.
And the last thing I'll say is that we're gonna have another listening session, in June.
June 26th, and it'll be at Osprey Wilds, which is very close to the Kettle River, so hopefully
So
you'll,
repeat that with
Yeah.
a microphone.
yes.
June 26th at Osprey Wilds. And you can find information on that listening section. It's not there yet, but it will be very shortly on the Wild Rivers Conservancy website under events. So look for that, and we would appreciate people to have input there as well.
And if you know people who are, well, we're here today, might be curious, people are legislators or officials or educators, your community. Call, use Katie's name at Wild Rivers Conservancy or Sophia at waterlegacy.org. And we'll make sure to issue them a special invitation with their own personalized email so that we can start building a community of people who at least are knowledgeable or are becoming part of the conversation. Thank you all so
Thanks.
much.